Deficient memory. With some people having an exceptionally good memory, there are also people that have a really bad memory. And some of it are due to syndromes that are associated with memory loss. So now we'll be talking about amnesia and Alzheimer's disease, the two prominent diseases that causes memory loss. Let us begin with amnesia. According to Robbins, amnesia is a severe loss of explicit memory. And when we say explicit memory, these are our conscious memories that we try and intentionally and voluntarily recall. An example of that is remembering some information or faces of some people we've come across or past events and any other thing that we intentionally and try hard to remember. That is explicit memory. And we will be talking about that later on the following slide. So first, let's get to know the types of amnesia. We have main types of amnesia. We have the retrograde amnesia and anterograde amnesia. Amnesia may actually result in partial or complete memory loss, depending on the severity of the damage of the brain. We will know what these types of amnesia are. So first is the retrograde amnesia. In this type of amnesia, there is a loss of memory for events prior to whatever trauma induces memory loss. So in this type of amnesia, an individual is unable to recall past memories anymore, but the most effective ones are the recent past. Though the distant past are more like not really that much affected. And an example of this is the case reported by Richie Russell and a colleague in 1946, wherein a 22-year-old landscaper was thrown from his motorcycle in August of 1933. And a week after the accident, the young man was able to converse sensibly because he seemed to have recovered. But it quickly became apparent that he had suffered a severe loss of memory for events that had occurred prior to the trauma or the before he got that brain injury. So he had no recollection of the intervening years because on questioning he gave the date as February 1922. He believed himself to be a schoolboy, but he was finally able to recall everything that had happened up to a few minutes prior to the accident, and that return started with the least recent event and proceeded toward more recent events until he recovered his memory for most of the events of the previous years. But in retrograde amnesia, the memories that return typically do so starting from the more distant past, such as the case of this 22-year-old that he remembered himself and he believed himself to be a schoolboy until he got back his memory. But then in retrograde amnesia, often events that happened right before the trauma are never recalled. And the next type of amnesia is the anterograde amnesia. It is the inability to remember events that occur after a traumatic event. And this is in this type of amnesia, this is where impairment in learning occurs. Because unlike the retrograde amnesia, wherein all memories are lost, a person with anterograde amnesia can still remember that those past events, although not really perfect memory of those past, but an individual can still remember those past events that had happened before the trauma. But the thing is, an individual who has this type of amnesia is unable to take in new information and form new memories. Some of this type of amnesia is this one is the case of this famous case of HM. HM underwent a brain surgery to save him from continual disruptions due to uncontrollably epilepsy. While the operation took place on September 1, 1953, but it was largely experimental. That is why the results were highly unpredictable. Although he had good recollection of events that had occurred before his operation, however, HM's memory loss severely affected his life because he cannot remember events that occur after a traumatic event, which means that he cannot remember or cannot take in new memories after he had gone to the surgery. Every time he meets a new person, he cannot recall the name of that new person he met, and regardless of the number of times they interacted. And apparently, HM lost his ability to recollect any new memories of the time following his operation. And again and again, he recalls and forgets and recalls and forgets. It's like everything is the first time. In retrograde amnesia, you cannot recall the past events, but you can still take in new information. But in anterograde amnesia, you cannot take in new information or new memories anymore, but you can still remember your past events or past memories that you have before the traumatic event. Okay, we have this another type of amnesia. Although some investigators question this type of amnesia if this is even truly a form of amnesia at all, but we have this infantile amnesia, which is the inability to recall events that happened when we were very young. And I actually feel like that I have that kind of amnesia, but I'm not diagnosing myself having infant amnesia, but I feel ko lang. And yes, that is the inability to recall what we have experienced when we were very young, something like that. And there's actually a lot more types of amnesia that is found and that is studied, but we're just gonna talk about those. The next is the amnesia and the explicit implicit memory. So what is this explicit memory and what is this implicit memory? Explicit memory, also known as declarative memory, refers to a system of storage and recall of conscious memories and is recalled intentionally or voluntarily. And explicit memory is typically impaired in amnesia, while the implicit memory, also called as the non-declarative memory, is related to unconscious memories such as the ability to perform actions automatically, make connection, and respond to stimuli. And an example of explicit memory are those times that we are recalling what had happened during an event, remembering details, and also it is an explicit memory when you are trying to recall what you have read or studied while answering a test or exam. And an example of implicit memory, those actions that we do right away or without even the need to recall anything, just to perform an action, is an implicit memory. We just do it automatically. Example of that is writing. When we write, we just automatically know how to write because we have once learned that and we already know that. Example, if we don't want to write but we still know how to write because we don't think and recall it like saan pa nga ipusulat ang ganyan letter or word. We just automatically knows how to write when we are going to write. Anyway, so studying amnesia patients gave researchers more insights about the distinction of these two between explicit and implicit memories. And they found out that amnesia patients performs extremely poor on most explicit memory tasks, but they may show normal or almost normal performance on tasks involving implicit memory such as cued recall tasks and word completion tasks. So researcher did this word completion task when they asked the amnesics, those people with amnesias, whether they previously had seen the word. They have shown them or completed, and the result is they were unlikely to remember the specific experience of having seen that word. And furthermore, these amnesics do not explicitly recognize words they have seen. They just know that they know that word, but they cannot really remember how did they know that word or where they have come across with that word. So although the distinction between implicit memory and explicit memory has been observed in amnesia patients, both those people with amnesias and normal participants still shows the presence of implicit memory. It's like the implicit memory are spared when a person has amnesia. So amnesia patients may perform extremely poor on the traditional memory tasks, such as recalling or recognizing a memory of declarative knowledge, or the explicit ones, the explicit memory. However, they may demonstrate improvement in performance resulting from learning, remembered practice, especially when they're engaged in tasks that require procedural knowledge. And procedural knowledge are those tasks that would include solving puzzles, learning to read, or mastering motor skills. Another example for this procedural knowledge is that patients with amnesia were asked to drive in a normal situation, and they were able to operate and control the car as a normal driver would do. However, the investigators also exposed the patients to a simulation in which a complex accident sequence was experienced. So in this situation, the patients with amnesia showed significant impairment because they could not recall the proper response to this kind of situation. And this finding is in line with the fact that in patients with amnesia, implicit procedural knowledge is spared while explicit knowledge is impaired. Next is the amnesia and neuropsychology. Studying amnesia patients. Through it, they have revealed much how memory depends on the effective functioning of particular structures of the brain. And by looking for matches between a particular injury in the brain, or lesions in the brain, and particular deficits of functions, researchers come to understand how normal memory functions. That is why when neuropsychologists studying cognitive processes, they frequently look for dissociations of functions. In dissociations, normal individuals show the presence of a particular function, but people with specific lesions or injury in the brain show the absence of that particular function. This absence occurs despite the presence of normal functions in other areas. What this dissociation is trying to explain is that even if there is a particular injury in some part of the brain, that lesions or that injury is the only one that does not function properly. And the other parts of the brain, those are not injured, are still in their normal functioning. They're still functioning normally, because although there are parts of the brain that have injured, it does not really affect like the whole brain. And to understand this, for example, is the reticular activating system. If you remember this RAS, it performs a crucial role in behavioral arousal, consciousness, and motivation. And the normal functioning of a proportion of the brain, which is the reticular activating system, it is very essential to life. But this life of ours does not only depends on the RAS, because it takes a lot of other part of the body to support life, and also essential to life. And it means that even if there is one that is not functioning well, the other parts can still function well despite the existence of an injured part of the brain or the body. Although the RAS is essential to life, persons that may be the result of malfunction in other structure of the brain, of the body. The researchers also have observed this, what they call double dissociations. In double dissociations, people with different kinds of neuropathological conditions show opposite patterns of deficits. A double dissociation can be observed if a lesion in brain structure 1 leads to impairment in memory function A, but not in memory function B. And a lesion in brain structure 2 leads to impairment in memory function B, but not in memory function A. So, para mas masabtan siya, no? For some areas of the brain, neuropsychologists have managed to observe the presence of a double dissociation. For example of this is where people with injury in their left parietal lobe of the brain show inability to retain information in short-term memory, but they show no impairment of long-term memory. Although the short-term memory is not functioning well, the long-term memory is still good and intact. So they continue to encode, store, and retrieve information in long-term memory, even if with a little difficulty. So, in contrast, person with injury in their middle or temporal regions of the brain shows relatively normal short-term memory of verbal materials such as letters and words, but they show serious inability to retain new verbal materials in long-term memory. So that is just how double dissociations work. So it strongly supports the notion that particular structures of the brain play particular vital roles in memory, and disturbances or injuries in these areas cause severe deficit in memory information. But we cannot say that memory or even part of memory resides in these structures only. So studies of brain injured patients are informative and at least suggestive of how memory works. So that is why at present, cognitive neuropsychologists have found that double dissociations support several distinctions, and these distinctions are those between brief memory and long-term memory, and between declarative, which is the explicit memory, and non-declarative, which is the implicit memory. Now let us talk about Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease was first identified by this German psychiatrist Alois Alzheimer in 1907. Alzheimer's disease is an irreversible progressive brain disorder that slowly destroys memory and thinking skills and eventually the ability to carry out the simplest task. Alzheimer's disease is a disease of older adults that causes dementia, as well as progressive memory loss. And dementia is a loss of intellectual function that is severe enough to impair one's everyday life. Alzheimer's disease is typically recognized on the basis of loss of intellectual function in daily life, and it is only after death that they can definitely diagnose it as an Alzheimer's. But now, with the existence of these imaging techniques and brain scanners and other machines, they were able to compare brain scans of individuals with and without Alzheimer's. So it shows here that as the disease advances, there is diminishing cognitive activity in the areas of the brain associated with memory functions. And Alzheimer's disease leads to an atrophy or decrease in size of the brain. Here you can see in image A, this is a brain scan of a normal individual, and in image B, an image of a brain scan of an individual with early stage Alzheimer's. And you can see that in the image B, the brain scan of an early stage Alzheimer's, you can see the atrophy, the black space over there in the brain of the Alzheimer's patient. You can compare it sa the brain scan of a healthy person. There's a decrease in size of the brain. And here in image C depicts the PET scan of an individual with late stage Alzheimer's and a healthy person. Cognitive activity in the brain associated with memory function decreases. A person have an Alzheimer's disease, their brains leads to an atrophy, especially in the hippocampus and frontal and temporal brain regions. And the brains of people with the disease show flakes and tangles that are not found in normal brains. Those flakes are the dense protein deposits found outside the nerve cells of our brain. And those tangles are pairs of filaments that become twisted around each other. So they are found in the cell body and dendrites of neurons, as you can see in the image. They are found in the cell body and dendrites of neurons. That is why a person is only diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease when he or she has an impaired, at least one area, that is area of dysfunction in the domains of language, motor, attention, executive function, personality, or object recognitions. And those symptoms of a patient with Alzheimer's disease are of gradual onset, and the progression is continuous and irreversible. We have this what we call familial. This is a special kind of Alzheimer's disease, and it is also known as early onset Alzheimer's disease. And this is linked to a genetic mutation. So people with genetic mutation always develop the disease. And this early onset Alzheimer's disease, it results in the disease exhibiting itself early, often before even 50 years of age, and sometimes as early as the 20s. We have this also what we call late onset Alzheimer's disease, which appears to be complexly determined and related to a variety of possible genetic and environmental influences, which none of it have been conclusively identified. So what are the early signs of Alzheimer's disease? One of the early signs of Alzheimer's disease is the impairment of episodic memory. When we say episodic memory, this is a form of long-term memory, which is under the explicit memory, the one that I have mentioned earlier. Explicit memory, or what we call the declarative memories. This episodic memory allows human to recall personal experiences from the past, and if a person have this early kind of sign, they're likely their episodic memory are likely to starting to impaired. Yes. And the next sign is trouble remembering things, especially those things that were learned in a temporal or spatial context. Example of temporal is the one that we do, such as searching for something or for some object. And spatial is when we're trying to remember its application of a place or as a debate or as a if one of the signs is trouble remembering those kind of things. Next is, as the disease progresses, semantic memory also begins to fade, begins to go. Semantic memories are the ability to remember knowledge and facts. And when you have this, when the sign, yes, one of the signs of Alzheimer's disease is the semantic memory beginning to fade. The next sign is non-declarative memory, or the implicit memory, those memories that are automatically just there that we remember, are spared until near the very end of its course, which is death. Those are the signs of Alzheimer's disease. There are actually memory tests that may be given to assess whether an individual has Alzheimer's disease. However, definitive diagnosis is possible only through analysis of brain tissue, which, as mentioned earlier, show plaques and tangles in cases of disease. So they did this test wherein they let an individual see a sheet of paper containing 4 words, and each word belongs to a different category. The examiner says the category name for each of the words. Then the individual must point to the appropriate word. For example, if the category is animal, the individual might point to a picture of any animal such as cow or dog, yes. And a few minutes after the words have been presented, individuals make an attempt to recall all the words they saw. And if they cannot recall a word, they are given the category to which the word belongs. And the result is some individuals cannot remember the words, even when prompted with the categories. And Alzheimer's patients score much worse on this kinds of tests than do other individuals. Although the progression of Alzheimer's disease is irreversible, and there's no actually cure for this disease, it can be slowed down somehow. And there are 2 main drugs that are currently being used for slowing down the progress of Alzheimer's disease. We have this donepezil or Aricept. Although research evidence is mixed, but it suggests that at best, Aricept may slightly slow progression of the disease, but it cannot reverse it. But we have this another drug that we call memantine, or sold as Namenda or Ipixa, that can supplement Aricept and slow progression of the disease more. However, these 2 drugs have different mechanism. Aricept slows destruction of the neurotransmitter acetylcholine in the brain, while memantine inhibits a chemical that overexcites brain cells and leads to cell damage and death. So these 2 drugs are the main drugs that are currently used in slowing down Alzheimer's